Alright guys, so today we're going to talk about solving quadratics in what I call the happy way. So previously we've looked at factoring and completing the square. Both of those are really good for use when you are on the calculator inactive part of your test. So you don't have access to your calculator, then you can factor or complete the square, and both of those are good ways, algebraic ways to reach a solution. However, if you have access to your calculator, I would highly recommend doing the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is going to be your calculator saving grace because it's quick, it's accurate, and it saves you a lot of trouble in the long run. So if you have access to your calculator, use the quadratic formula. So what exactly is the quadratic formula? This is the quadratic formula. It looks a little overwhelming. It's really not. But you absolutely 100% must memorize it. Absolutely. If you don't learn anything else in Algebra 1, learn the quadratic formula. So our answers of x are the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and all of that over 2 times a. Okay? We have this plus or minus because we take into consideration that the quadratic potentially will cross the x-axis at 2 places. Okay, so one would be at plus, one would be at minus. This will only work for a quadratic in standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c, because that's where I'm going to get my letters to plug into the equation. I highly recommend, if you have access to a calculator and your leading coefficient here is something that's not 1, do the quadratic formula. It's much easier than trying to multiply a times c, what will multiply to give me that, add to give me this, and then factor. Quadratic formula is much nicer, much easier, and a lot faster. So let's break apart the quadratic formula at first. So I want to first take a look at this part because it should look familiar to you. X equals the opposite of b over 2 times a. So this should be a very familiar formula because we've already learned this part of the quadratic formula. This was our equation for getting the axis of symmetry. Okay, so if we needed to find the axis of symmetry of a parabola, we would use x equals the opposite of b over 2a. So we've used this already. The second part of the quadratic formula is this part that is under the square root. So it's the b squared minus 4ac part. This is called the discriminant. Okay? And the discriminant tells us a lot about a quadratic because it tells us how many roots there will be. How many places is it going to cross the x-axis? If the discriminant, if this is equal to 0, okay, so when I plug in my numbers for b, a, and c and I get 0, then I know that there is only one root. So I know the graph of my parabola is one of those where it doesn't cross the x-axis, it just touches the x-axis at the vertex. If I plug my numbers in and I get a number that is bigger than 0, and it doesn't matter how much bigger, just that it's bigger than 0, then I have 2 roots. Okay, so in this case, my parabola would actually go over the x-axis and have 2 points of intersection. And lastly, if the parabola is if the discriminant is less than 0, I have no real solutions. So what does that mean? That means that my parabola does not go across the x-axis. The vertex is not on the opposite side of the rest of the parabola. So it doesn't cross the x-axis, so if it doesn't cross the x-axis, I have no points that x could be. So that would be no real solutions. So let's use the discriminant to determine how many solutions each one of these quadratics have. So all we're looking at is b squared minus 4ac. b here is 5, so I have 5 squared minus 4 times a, which is 4, times c, which is negative 3. 5 squared is 25. 4 times 4 is 16 times negative 3. 25 minus 16 times negative 3 is negative 48 plus a positive. I get positive 73. Well, this answer is greater than 0, so I know I have 2 roots. I know this graph is going to have 2 x values where it crosses the x-axis. So let's look here. If I plug into b squared minus 4ac, 4 here is b, so 4 squared, minus 4 times a, 2, times c, which is 2. So I have 4 squared minus 4 times 4. Well, I have 16 minus 16. Well, that equals 0. So this tells me that I have 1 root, and if it's only going to touch the x-axis, I know that this 1 root is also the vertex. Okay? So here, if I plug in b squared, 10 squared minus 4 times a, which is 5, times c, which is 6. 10 squared is 100. 100 minus 4 times 30. 100 minus 120 is negative 20. Well, this is less than 0, so I have no real solutions. Okay, so this graph will not ever cross the x-axis. So this is what the graph would look like if it did not cross the x-axis. This occurs when the discriminant is less than 0. Why is that? Why if I have b squared minus 4ac? Why if this is a negative number does it not make sense? And we have to go back to the quadratic formula. What was on top of this string of variables? And there was a square root. Can I take the square root of negative 4? Are there any two numbers that will multiply together to give me a negative? And it's impossible with real numbers. You could delve into imaginary, but we're not going there. So, there's nothing that will give me a negative if it's under a square root. And your calculator can't handle that. If you plug this into the quadratic formula, and your calculator, if you have a non-real answer, will give you calculator error. That just means no real solutions. Take it for what it is. The graph does not cross the x-axis. Put it down and move on. So now let's take the quadratic formula and let's apply it to some word problems. So here we have an object launched 19.6 meters from a 58.8 meter tall platform. It gives us the equation, so this is fabulous. It tells us that the equation for the object's height, s, so here's where our height is, after t seconds, so this is our time, t is time, and this is the equation where s is in meters. When does the object strike the ground? Okay, so we need to start developing some patterns for quadratic word problems. Okay, first it asks us when, so that means I'm looking for t. Or if this was written in standard form, it would be x. I want to solve for x. When does the object strike the ground? Okay, so it gives me a height. What is the height of the object if it's on the ground? And that is when, if the object is hitting the ground, then you're going to set the quadratic equal to 0. So I'm replacing s of t with 0. So now I have a quadratic that's set equal to 0, so I can simply apply the quadratic formula. A here is negative 4.9, B is 19.6, and C is 58.8. Okay, so for our quadratic formula, we have x squared. No, we don't. We have x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2 times a. So all I'm going to do now is plug in my numbers into this formula in my calculator. Notice here that there is a negative out front. You need to go ahead and put that negative, and then b will go in parentheses. Okay, so the negative is out front, b goes in parentheses. So let me show you what that would look like on your calculator. Okay, So my quadratic formula, I think the easiest way to do this is to go ahead and set up a fraction bar on the calculator. So to do that, you hit alpha or the green button and then y equals. Then it gives you the option to do n over d, that's numerator over denominator, so you just click enter. And now it sets you up a fraction. So I know on the top I should have the opposite of b, so negative parentheses 19.6, okay, negative b. Then we can only do one operation at a time. We have plus and we have minus. So let's just do plus first. Plus, okay, then I need to do the square root, and in parentheses, b squared, 19.6 squared, minus 4 times a, which is negative 4.9, times c in parentheses, 58.8. Okay, don't hit enter, hit down. That gets you to the bottom, and down should be 2 times a, negative 4.9. Enter. So one of my solutions is x is negative 2. Okay? So let me write that down. X is negative 2. Alright, but now that's only one of my solutions. Instead of rewriting all that, I'm going to go up here and highlight it, click enter again, and that will copy the equation. Then you're just going to move your cursor back through it and change that plus that you did to a minus. That way you know that you have the exact same thing typed in. Oh, I've gone too far. So I need to move over to the plus, turn it into a minus, now hit enter. So now I have 6 as another option. Okay, so I have x equals negative 2 or x equals 6. Notice here, one answer doesn't really make sense. If we're talking about when, we're talking about a time, a negative answer does not make sense. So we're going to say that 6 seconds is when the object would strike the ground. Okay, so that is a crash course of the quadratic formula. You're going to be using it a lot to solve word problems. Just remember, when you insert numbers in here, put them in parentheses. That's probably the most important thing to remember of the quadratic formula besides the quadratic formula itself, which is x equals opposite b plus minus square root b squared minus 4ac over 2a. All right, memorize this formula, do your notebook, and I will see you tomorrow.